All right, well, why don't we get started? We're just a couple minutes past the hour, and we appreciate everybody joining, so we don't want to delay it any longer. First off, I want to thank everybody for joining. We are doing a session here today on the evolving endpoint security, and specifically why antivirus alone might not be enough, as the threats have changed in the landscape of cybersecurity and healthcare. My name is Bill Santeris. I'm the Chief Product Officer at Anatomy IT. I'm fortunate enough to be doing a panel with both Rick and Jan, who I'll introduce in one moment. We're definitely excited to talk about the recent changes in cybersecurity, some things that are in the news that you're seeing on a daily basis, and looking to define what are some minimum security standards that you should be implementing as an organization to make sure that you're protecting against evolving threats, and able to recover your business operations in the event of an attack. So we'll be talking about some of those things and how you can overall improve your cyber defense. Just a couple of housekeeping measures. First off, everybody's in listen only mode. We are going to be monitoring the chat, and we'd also ask that you put any questions in the Q&A format of Teams, and we'll answer those as we go, or we'll get to them at the end. And then you'll also receive a recording of this webinar sent to the email address that you registered with. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our panelists. First off is Rick Passero. Rick is our Chief Information Security Officer here at Anatomy IT. Rick comes to us with significant background in IT operations, leadership, and cyber security. He's a certified information system security professional, extensive background across healthcare, financial services, insurance, legal, and technology sectors. He really looks at cybersecurity and risk management holistically, helping our clients make sure that they're making the right investments based upon their risk exposure and their risk tolerance. So thank you, Rick, for joining us. And then secondly, we have Jan Koster, who is our Director of Security. Jan comes to us with extensive risk management experience. He's been a risk management executive for 25 plus years in the consulting industry. He specializes in cybersecurity, risk management in general, and then business consulting services. And really, Jan's expertise spans not only security remediation, but building the foundational things, IT and operationally, through audits and compliance to ensure that systems and businesses are ready for any cybersecurity attack that might come up. So thank you both for joining us, and we'll jump right into the content and the questions, and I'll grill you for a little bit, and then we'll open it up for questions. So first off, we really want to go through a few different areas. So I'll just hit the agenda before we jump in. Understanding the evolving nature of cybersecurity attacks. So I think everybody saw last week the impact of even though it wasn't a cybersecurity breach, but the impact of the CrowdStrike event last week and how organizations struggled to recover. In healthcare, we saw this year the Change Healthcare event that really impacted a lot of clients and a lot of customers that were using Change systems to process reimbursements and how they struggled with that. So we'll talk about the evolving nature of the threats and the attack surface and what we can help you do with it. And then certainly we'll talk about the latest minimum security standards. So we believe that there's a core set of tenets that you should follow in terms of good IT practices, and we're going to talk about those. And then we're going to talk about some of the limitations of the traditional security tools, specifically antivirus, and why you might need something stronger than that to protect your business. We'll talk about some really practical next steps that you can implement, and then most importantly, we'll open it up to Q&A to see what kind of questions there are out there. So with that, why don't we jump right in? So first off, really, when we look at the cybersecurity landscape and how it impacts organizations, we believe that, looking at what's going on in the landscape and what has changed over the last several years is really important. So Rick, maybe you could start off by telling us what are some of the, current threats that we're seeing and vulnerabilities, obviously, related to those threats, and how are they impacting businesses today? And obviously, if you have some examples that you could share, that would be great.
Thanks, Bill, and good afternoon, everyone. So diving right in, fundamentally the answer to this is in 2024, businesses face the most complex and rapidly evolving cybersecurity threat landscape in history. We're seeing really a very rapid increase in the evolution of these attacks and how quickly they're able to adapt to our defenses. Um, so, some of the threats that we have been dealing with for a long time have kind of morphed into uh, more serious threats and different types of threats that are more difficult to defend against. So, for example, ransomware has been around for a long time. It's not a new concept. Um, this year we have seen a surge in ransomware cases, but it's also oftentimes coinciding with what we call an extortion attack, which then turns into something that's sometimes referred to as a double jeopardy attack, wherein not only does the threat actor come in and encrypt your systems and lock you out of it, but they also actually, before they do that, they exfiltrate your data. So while they're extorting you on one side to get your systems back up, they are also extorting you on the other side to prevent the release of that data. That is challenging in a number of ways, and we'll talk more about this in a little bit, but the traditional antivirus is fundamentally almost useless against attacks like that because there's no malware deployed. Um, so that's a very big threat that we're seeing these days. Similarly, not a new threat, but one that we've seen a dramatic rise in over the past year or two is just business email compromise, or BEC. So business email compromise does remain a very prevalent threat. And that's basically just where attackers use phishing or malware to gain access to business email accounts and then use those email accounts to perpetrate fraud. Again, in these cases, most of the time there is no actual malware being deployed. So these attacks are very difficult, often for traditional security defensive measures to protect against. Other categories of threats and techniques that we're seeing out there include cloud vulnerabilities with the proliferation and widespread adoption of cloud services. Attackers are targeting cloud environments more frequently, often with valid credentials and legitimate tools that blend in with normal user activity, again, making detection very difficult. We are also seeing, with the rise of generative AI, we're seeing a whole new categories of threats, including much more advanced phishing campaigns, deep fakes, and that sort of thing than we've ever seen before. Social engineering in general is becoming more prevalent and much harder to defend against. AI is also being used to create much more sophisticated malware in general. It's really being used as almost like a force multiplier in some cases. AI is used by the threat actors in some cases to perpetrate attacks against targets that maybe in the past might not have been worth their time, so to speak. They're able to attack thousands of organizations using similar attacks very quickly. So we've seen kind of the penetration of some more sophisticated attacks that, historically we might have only seen in the enterprise space actually start to target SMBs. So that's a major factor. The next area I would say is supply chain attacks are still very prevalent. These are attacks that attack the relationship between vendors and clients. This is especially attractive to threat actors because it basically allows them to breach multiple organizations from a single point of access. So this has been used in a number of widespread breaches that have made the news in the past couple of years. Um, again, can be very difficult to defend against because there's a certain point that we do have to trust our vendors and we allow them access into our systems to do the job that we hired them to do. But then when they get compromised, it does become a much larger deal. And then lastly, the last threat I would probably call out for this would just be unmanaged and legacy devices in general. We see a lot of attacks that originate from either entirely unmanaged devices or devices that are not fully protected, perhaps because they are obsolete or simply no longer support the latest protections. These devices often lack adequate security controls, which makes them really easy targets for attackers. So this could be anything from, an obsolete firewall to a fully unmanaged personal device that an employee is using.
Great. Now, Rick, I think that was very helpful and comprehensive. I think if you look at the number of threats coming in, a lot of them are the same threats that we've seen for the last 15, 20 years. They're just evolving and coming at a more rapid pace and using new AI technologies to exploit businesses. So that is really interesting. And there's really two sides to it. One, you want to protect the data, especially if you're in healthcare, you're protecting patient data. If you're in other business, you're protecting personally identifiable information and potentially PCI. So protecting the data is critical, but also keeping your business operating, right? Like making sure that your systems aren't down while you recover from an outage. And so those are two things that you have to protect for as these threats evolve. Jan, we've seen this acceleration of compromises in the news, and I mentioned CrowdStrike, while not a compromise, was a business impacting event. We saw an AT&T compromise just a couple of weeks ago, and then in healthcare, we've seen several this year. What have you seen that is different this year that has caused such a significant increase? Are we seeing more threats, or new threats, or just the tools and approaches, as we said, use of AI, just simulating attacks at a much greater scale? What are you seeing?
Yeah, great. Thanks, Bill. Yeah, certainly, the threat landscape doesn't really change much. It just gets larger and larger. Certainly, historically, many hackers would basically go after large companies because that would give you a lot of exposure, and it would be great to, as a challenge, to break into the larger companies. Today, it's a lucrative business. There's tons of people out there that do this. They do it for profit. Obviously, it's not anymore like to be excited about being able to break in somewhere, but it's really a moneymaker. So so the threat is coming from all kinds, and it's really approaching all companies now as well. Like Rick was saying as well, there is many ways of doing this. There's many companies that threat companies that now share the data, share the means to break in, even sell their tools as to how to break in. And that's just gets multiplied by going after the companies that are the weakest, of course, to get in. And historically, it's like you said, the larger companies are well protected. They try to protect well, and the smaller companies are usually not as protected as well. So so the smaller companies are now becoming a bigger target. I think we see the larger still in the news, but we see in our business, of course, we see many of our companies and our peer companies that have lots of opportunities where they're being targets. So certainly see a lot of uptick in doing it. At the end of the day, they're still coming after our clients' data the same way as they used to do it, just with improved tools.
Really good points, Jan. And if I can just jump in,
Yeah.
add a few thoughts there. The business aspect, I think, is really important to consider here. I've been doing cybersecurity in one way or another for going on 25 years now. And when I first started in the industry, it was a very different class of threats that we were dealing with, right? It was a lot of what we called script kiddies, or generally very unsophisticated attacks. We were one of the biggest threats we had to deal with was people abusing the messenger function in Windows NT, for example, to spread messages about save the whales or what have you. It wasn't really a business until recently. That is completely different these days. Cybersecurity, hacking and data compromises. This is a $4 trillion industry these days. There are people, in different countries that get up every day, they put on a suit and tie, they drive to their office building, they wave hello to the security guard and to the HR person. They sit down at their desk, and their job all day long is basically to take what you have. This is a business. This is no longer people doing this for fun or for the challenge. You have something that is valuable, whatever that might be, whatever your business is. whether that's information, whether that's cash, or whether that's access or the trust of your clients. There's something you have that is valuable to someone else, and it is somebody else's job to take it from you. That's really like fundamentally what the biggest difference is in the threat landscape, is that this is business now. It's not just kids looking for fun. This is somebody's job, and we have to take it seriously as a result.
Yeah, I think those are great points. It's an extension of fraud, and they're trying to get to businesses that might not be as protected as some of the larger ones because they're an easier target. But certainly, there's a number of things that even small businesses can do pretty quickly to protect their environment. So we don't want to just talk about the challenges. We want to talk about, what are some of the things that organizations can do from an IT perspective and a security perspective, because both are relevant, that can protect their environment from these threats, and then, more importantly, keep their business operating and functioning. So, Rick, can you talk about what are some of the minimum acceptable security standards that are becoming necessary for any business, right? So not just healthcare, not just certain large organizations, but any business wanting to protect their environment from threats of data exposure and threats of major outages due to a compromise.
Sure. Very good question and good points. Again, when I started in this industry, I worked at the time, relatively small healthcare provider, and we considered ourselves one of the leading secure healthcare organizations in the world, because we had a firewall and antivirus. The bar has certainly moved since then radically, where that minimum security standard, or really the minimum that you should be doing to protect yourself, does include, kind of a lot more. Cyber risk is a business risk. It's a really important aspect to consider for any of the, practice admins or business owners out there. The ransomware or these other kinds of threats can cost your organization millions and millions of dollars. This is not something that's going to come out of IT budgets. So it is really important to, consider this holistically from a risk management perspective at the business level. So what are some of those things that you can do to protect your business? Again, it really hasn't changed that much in the past 10, 20 years. Fundamentally, there are a few things you can do. User awareness is top of mind, especially with the increasing sophistication of some of these attacks and the force multiplying effect of artificial intelligence and social engineering. This is probably the most important thing you can do, is to arm your users with the knowledge to protect themselves and your organization. A lot of times the correct response to a security issue that appears to be technical is going to be an analog response. If you receive an email saying, please send my ACH payment to this other bank account this month, probably the best response is to pick up the phone and call offline and validate that information is real and that you're not being subjected to a business email compromise. This is the kind of thing that can really only happen through process and through training. So it's really important to train your users so that they have those kind of alarm bells that go off, and they can identify those red flags as to when they should take certain actions, such as responding offline. Next, I would say one of the most important things you can do is just access control in general. So there are technical measures to access control. So of course, we do recommend robust authentication protocols, having complex passwords and so forth. Multi-factor authentication is extremely important. It is arguably the most effective technical control you can put in place to prevent unauthorized access to your accounts. But there is no silver bullet or panacea in healthcare. So what do we do? So after a successful authentication of a user, the idea is to limit what a given account has access to. So in cybersecurity, we call this the principle of least privilege. This is the idea of basically just ensuring users have only the access you need. The reality is, with the increasing prevalence and sophistication of attacks today, it is likely that your organization will fall victim to an attack. At the end of the day, you can't really prevent any attacks. There's no such thing as 100% risk prevention. So, what you do is assume that there is a compromise and then work to prevent the impact of that compromise. Especially at smaller companies, it's very common to basically see no access control or segmentation in place, where everyone in the organization has access to the company file share that has all the crown jewels and all the data for the entire organization. Um, and I get it to a certain degree. You trust your people and so forth. It can be an administrative overhead to try to manage that. But then what happens when that account is compromised is that, as I was saying, about the ransomware attacks and the rise of extortion attacks, very often what we see is that one user account gets compromised and it results in the exfiltration of a lot of data that that user really didn't need to do their job. So the principle of least privilege tells us to minimize the access to data and application that a user has to that which they need to do their job only. Lastly, I'm going to say endpoint detection and response, which we'll talk a little bit more about in a moment, is absolutely critical. Many of the attacks that I've discussed do not involve deploying malware in a traditional sense, which means that a traditional antivirus is not going to defend against them, oftentimes in any way. So endpoint detection and response is a more proactive and preventative security solution than traditional AV. And it's basically constantly searching for indicators of a cyber attack to alert us and detect and respond to cyber attacks that are underway, so that we can minimize their impact and contain it and recover from it quickly. Lastly, I'm going to say, as part of the standard, just keeping things up to date is really important. As I was saying before, threat actors often exploit vulnerabilities in older software devices or IT systems to gain an initial foothold. And then offsite backups are really critical. Again, the same line of thought. You have to assume that something eventually will happen, and you have to be prepared for it. And that includes the ability to recover your data if the worst does happen.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Rick. And a lot of that, as you mentioned, it's good practices that have existed for a long time that just need to be relooked at and implemented, making sure you have good backups, making sure you're staying modernized. Obviously some, concerns about the malware protection, and we'll talk about that in a moment, but a lot of the things that you bring up, user awareness training and all of that, good IT practices, continue to follow those and implement them. Jan, anything you can add further that you might be seeing as critical requirements against these threats that we're seeing today, and also any of the things that Anatomy IT might be doing to help their customers today that we can help people navigate these threats?
Sure. Yeah. No. Great. Obviously, Rick, you mentioned all the key pieces of what needs to be in place to protect yourself, and any company needs to do that, large or small. And in every of those areas that Rick mentioned, there are many deviations and options that anybody can use to weapon themselves against and defend themselves against attacks. At the end of the day, it's a couple of big buckets. I always see it as, it's people, process, and technology. Those are the three things that have to be in place at every organization, no matter how small or no matter how large. People need to be, really thinking about whenever they get an email or whenever they get a phone call or whenever they, design a program, as to what they're doing and how they're protecting that and how they are following up on that. Processes need to be in place at any organization when something does go wrong or when something is almost going wrong. what do you do, and how do you prevent from any spreading of it. And then, of course, technology are the tools that are available. They're evolving on a daily basis because the threats are evolving on a daily basis as well. But it's critical that any organization put those three pieces together. So people, process, and technology is key. I think that from what we are doing from Anatomy, we want to be a partner. We want to be a partner of all our clients. We need to fight this together, and we need to protect every client's data together. We cannot do it alone, and you cannot do it alone. So we really like to be build this partnership. There's a couple of things that we have done within Anatomy, which basically is addressing all this. Is having a bunch of different tools that we like to deploy and like to provide to our clients to protect them more. Those tools evolve all the time, of course, as I mentioned earlier, and as Rick was talking about as well. It continues to the threats continue to evolve. So we need to work together to update those tools on a daily basis, basically. And use the security services that are out there, security consultants that are out there. Rick and I and our team, we do a lot of that. Certainly there are other out there as well, of course. But again, you need to build a partnership with your provider to help you stay as current as possible to protect yourself.
Great. No, really good points. And I guess if maybe Rick, for you, if if customers and organizations do some of these things that we're talking about, how does that help them when acquiring cyber liability insurance and even business interruption insurance, two categories that clients care about and sometimes are getting tougher to get as these threats evolve?
Yeah, absolutely. Good point. So, I spoke about the evolution of the threat landscape and a little bit about the evolution of our defensive measures. The insurance market in this regard has evolved extremely quickly too. It's almost an entirely different industry than it was when I first started doing IT. Back in the day, you almost just kind of signed up. You put your name on the line and signed a check, and you had insurance. It does not work that way these days. There was a time a few years ago where essentially all of the insurance companies that were underwriting cyber liability policies were basically losing their shirts. They were paying out $2-3 for every dollar that they brought in. So what we saw a few years ago was, one, a lot of the underwriters got out of the market entirely, so there's less competition in insurance. And we saw a very rapid, very significant evolution of the underwriting process when it came to anything related to cyber risk. Gone are the days where you basically just sign up. Getting insurance these days often requires multi-page assessments and attestations of having these security controls in place. And if you don't have them, oftentimes you'll be denied coverage entirely, or at a minimum, you're going to pay for it on the other side of your premiums. So having first of all, having cyber liability insurance is, again, just kind of part of this minimum standard. It's increasingly required in all sorts of contracts for business to business. And, as I was saying before, like a cyber incident can cost your organization millions of dollars. And unless you're in a position to be able to self-fund that, it really is mandatory to have to survive these events sometimes. So, to do that, you need to have these bare minimum standards that we're talking about. The insurance companies, not only are they going to ask you, do you have these things? They're going to ask, for example, do you do security awareness training for your employees? But we're actually seeing that evolve to the next level, where if you do have a compromise, they're going to ask you then for the proof of the training that you did provide. And, if Joe was the guy who clicked on the phishing link that resulted in the compromise of your business's data, and it turned out Joe did not participate or complete his training that year, a lot of times we have seen that be the cause of an insurance claim being denied. So it's not even enough just to have just to be able to check the box that we have this. You actually have to make sure that your controls are in place and effective and have actually happened, and that you can prove it. So it's really just part of that minimum standard. You gotta have your EDR, your security awareness training. That's all important, but you also have to be able to prove it. And you have to stay on top of ensuring that it is effective everywhere that you think it is. We call that continuous monitoring.
Really good points. And I think when it comes to cyber insurance, not only is it critical to have to support your business, but also they're very helpful in the event of a compromise. So if there was a compromise, you can leverage your cyber insurance provider to help with remediation. So we always recommend that you partner with a good cyber insurance company. They can help with remediation if there ever is a compromise. And as Rick said, they're going to ask a lot of questions, so you need to be ready for that. And we help our customers prepare for those questions if they ever do come up. Moving to the next piece, just to continue on, because we're running on time here a little bit. We wanted to talk a lot about why is antivirus no longer sufficient? When we think about malware protection of the past, it was always antivirus, next gen antivirus, and really that was enough to protect the workstations in any typical environment. But that's evolved, and really we've been pushing more towards an EDR, or the industry's been pushing more towards an endpoint detection and response platform versus antivirus. So Jan, can you tell us why that's changing and why is antivirus no longer enough?
Sure, yeah, Bill. So, antivirus has been around for as long as computers have been around, I think. Certainly, worked really well in the old days. But basically, antivirus measures against a known inventory of of suspicious malware or suspicious stuff that's on your computer, and that's what it takes. It takes a look at that. It's not nearly as proactive as EDR is. Basically what the industry is moving to is behavior based, where if there is some different kind of activities going on an endpoint, the EDR tool will then say, well, looks different because it has not happened before, or it's installing something that has never before, or a Word document is created with some strange attachments to it. It will identify that as being suspicious, and then basically put it into a whole pattern, if you will. Versus, like I said, the antivirus, where it really looks at a known inventory of compromises that are out there, that are known, and your PC will continuously look if something like that is coming on the PC. So certainly a lot more proactive to use EDR. The behavior based is certainly more like a lot more sophisticated to be able to to stop any activity that comes from hackers. Hackers obviously have becoming a lot more smarter as well. So we need to have more smarter tools out there than just antivirus.
Great. And as you said, right, antivirus is very pattern based, right? So if it knows the pattern, it can stop the pattern. But as Rick mentioned earlier, a lot of these threats aren't even driven by malware. So they're just driven by different activities that the EDR needs to be aware of or notice that it's different than the norm. And that's why it's able to keep up to date and stay evolving with it. And Rick, as you think about what Jan mentioned and how threats continue to evolve, how do we know EDR will evolve with the threats?
So that's fundamentally what it does. As Jan was saying, it's just a fundamentally different approach when you compare EDR versus traditional AV. So where traditional AV is very focused on preventing malware and viruses from infiltrating systems, again, generally by comparing files or activities it sees against a library of known threat types. EDR is endpoint detection and response. So again, it goes back to what I was saying before, almost assume compromise. EDR generally has an AV component to it where it will still try to prevent that malware or viruses from infiltrating a system, but then it goes a step further and provides you with the ability to detect and respond to threats that have actually compromised the system. So, one of the big problems with AV is just the idea of identifying the behavior. So, think about this, like what are some of the things that a user might use a computer for? Things like transferring data or encrypting their files to send to their colleagues, or performing advanced mathematical computations. Like these are things that computers are designed to do, and they're not inherently bad, at least from a perspective of antivirus. Uh, the problem is that those behaviors are often very difficult to distinguish from data exfiltration or ransomware or advanced persistent threats or Bitcoin mining. And AV is, looking for things that are overtly bad and not seeing it in those cases. Many of these threats, especially with the rise of AI, being able to generate AI on malware on the fly, many of these threats are only seen once ever. So, that library is useless. EDR is centered around AI and behavioral analysis. So rather than saying like this file is bad, it's actually actively analyzing the processes on a system and uses those metrics against its own baseline learning that it does against an environment, and it uses cloud intelligence to determine the intent of what's running and determine if that should be allowed. So this is incredibly effective. It does generate a lot of data, which is where organizations like Anatomy IT would come in to help you manage all of that. All the data in the world does nothing if you don't react. So, that's the other critical part of EDR, is that it does have to actually be managed. AI is really smart. It's getting better every day. But there does still need to be some level of human decision making to help contain and fully eliminate threats. Even if AV or EDR stops a threat, maybe the ransomware gets stopped, but how did it get in? What else did the attacker do while they were in there? That's where a competent security team comes in.
Yeah, really good background. And it is interesting, right? As AI has accelerated the threats, AI has also been very helpful in the response to those threats. So, leveraging, artificial intelligence at scale, making sure that you're watching for threats is critical, and, putting in the tools that can do that. We do have a question in the Q&A that's relevant to this section. And just to remind everybody, if you have any questions, please drop them in the Q&A. We're happy to answer any questions you have about this. This one is specific to healthcare for clients that, have to do HIPAA regulations. Would EDR be a best practice for that? And do you think that will become a requirement for HIPAA regulations in the future?
So, that's a tough one. HIPAA is not especially prescriptive. It was written a very long time ago before EDR was a thing. So, of course, HIPAA doesn't specifically say that you need to have EDR. That being said, what it does tell you is that you need to perform an analysis of your risk in relation to how you are storing and using and protecting your electronic protected health information. I would say that any true comprehensive analysis of risk these days is going to point you to the threats and vulnerabilities that we discussed at the beginning of this webinar, which are things that, as we've covered, AV is not going to protect against. So while HIPAA doesn't explicitly say you need EDR, it does tell you that you need to have appropriate protections for your EPHI, and I would find it very hard to argue that would not include EDR. So, short answer is yes, I would say that it is required.
Yeah. Yeah, and a lot of standards organizations are recommending it as well. So it's not just going to be necessarily in the regulations of HIPAA, but the best practices of today will start requiring it, I think, more and more. So we talked about a lot here about minimally accepted standards. We talked about EDR, replacing antivirus. But where do people begin? So, Rick, maybe you could talk and go first about some of the easy but effective steps organizations can take today, because a lot of this is overwhelming, right? So, how do you get started on the journey of protecting your environment and making sure that you have a resilient environment and you protect the data that you're storing. Where do you start?
So there are some basics, like the things we've covered on the call today, things like implementing multi-factor authentication and EDR and doing some basic training of your users. That's a great place to start. The next steps from there are generally going to be organization specific. You want to really evaluate your own threat landscape in your own areas of risk. So really the best place to start there is to perform regular security audits and assessments to identify and address what your specific security weaknesses are, and then work with a professional or an expert to develop a roadmap to address them, to maintain a strong security posture and ensure compliance with the latest best practices. The best practices of yesterday could be leaving you vulnerable today. So, it's really important. This is not a one-time activity. It's an ongoing process. So definitely just maintain that continuous cycle of, assessing your current stance and ensuring that your security controls are in place. As far as easy and effective and potentially lower cost, next steps, I would say, in particular, in light of the events of last week with CrowdStrike, which again was not a security incident, but it was a major IT operational incident that impacted the availability of systems. So, it is security related, although not a cyber attack. I would say that really underscores the importance of having a resilient organization. And most of the time, what that means is the ability to operate your business offline. We live in a very connected world, and that's a scary thought to be able to be forced to conduct your business without relying on technology. But things will always happen, or things could always happen, I should say. There's no such thing as protection against every threat. So again, assume that something is going to happen and be prepared so that if your computers are down for however long, for a day or two, so that you have the ability to continue your business. I would say that's probably the biggest takeaway leading out of last week that I would impart on you all.
Yeah, really good points. And Jan, anything else to add there?
Yeah, no, I think we've covered all the bases here, obviously. Being well aware of the clients that are on the and the members that are on the call here. I certainly understand that not everybody has the means to have a very robust internal kind of security practice, and so for most of the folks that are on this call, I truly believe that you need to build a good relationship with your trusted cybersecurity advisor. We help all our clients obviously to protect their data as much as possible. There is many tools and processes that can be put in place. We talked about all of them and most of them earlier today. But I think you need to, if you don't have it in house, need to establish a good relationship with your IT provider from a cybersecurity perspective. Protection is not a one-day solution. It's not a one-day, one tool that you can put in there. It's an evolving road of new items that will come on your path. So looking forward to talk to anybody about this as well.
Great. Yeah, really good. And I think it's a journey, right? It's getting on the path and making sure that you start addressing these things. So, I'll put one last call out for questions. So we don't have any further questions in the chat, but I'll just give it one moment to see if we get any more questions in. Well, look, we really appreciate everyone's time today. We have a lot of passion around this subject, and we know that it's an ever-evolving environment that we're dealing with. So we want to keep the communication flowing, and certainly we're here if you have any questions or concerns about specific to your environment. Feel free to reach out to any of us or your account manager. We're happy to talk about it at any time and help you work on a path to prioritize what are the most important things you can do today to start, closing any compromise potential in your environment. So just please don't hesitate to reach out. We're here for any questions that you have in the future. And thank you again for joining. Have a great day, everyone.